Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Left Hook podcast. I am your host, James, and I'm joined by my ineffable co-host, Vice President Donald Trump. Jordie. Sorry, that was a bit of a slip of the tongue.
That's all right.
That's been happening a bit recently. That's all right. How are you today, mate?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. We've been good. Yeah. It's been an interesting week for news and politics, as always. We've got some interesting topics to bring to you this week. We're going to have a bit of a look at NATO, and we're going to look at a recent report by the Lancet Journal discussing what's been going on in Gaza, and a special envoy for anti-Semitism appointed here in Australia. But first, we have some breaking news.
The attempted assassination on President-elect Donald Trump. This all came out of Pennsylvania this morning, where Donald Trump was holding a rally, and a would-be assassin essentially fired a few shots at him. The president was injured. He was seen tackled to the ground by a security detail, and then afterwards was emerged unharmed, apart from what appeared to be like a small wound to his ear. There was a bit of blood coming out.
Yeah.
He then proceeded to defiantly raise up his fist like a some sort of revolutionary populist figure.
The modern day Che Guevara.
In America, correct. And was proceeded to be whisked off stage straight away by his security detail. So that it's still a story that's unfolding at the moment. So we don't have heaps of specific news.
But basically, the news is someone climbed onto a roof just outside the rally and fired, I think, 5 to 7 shots from a rifle.
Yep.
What was interesting I was reading this morning is that a witness tried to get the attention of security and the police for a couple of minutes, and nothing really happened. And then he managed to get these shots off, and it took him a couple of minutes to actually get up on the roof and shoot this man in the head.
Yeah.
And there's been no real discussion about his identity as of yet, but we will soon see.
Well, he was subsequently killed. He was subsequently killed. It was reported that his head was blown off.
Correct.
Very modest.
Yeah, very modest.
A very modest description.
Yeah.
But it's like all kind of attempted political assassinations in the United States. I don't think we'll ever truly know the full story.
Well, he's a modern JFK essentially now.
Oh, he absolutely, yeah. So,
what's interesting about this, about the assassination itself, is that even though he's not dead, he has in effect become a martyr.
Yeah,
because the Biden team and the Democrats have now taken down all anti-Trump advertising, so television ads, any sort of kind of pro-Biden Democrat propaganda has now been removed since the shooting. That's just obviously an interesting eventuation from the attempted assassination, and it will definitely galvanise his support base.
It will,
for sure.
And I think this event, like you said, it'll galvanise his support base, but it'll also, in my opinion, it's the death knell for the Biden campaign, essentially.
Yes.
Because I think we'll find there will be so much popularity, Trump's popularity will essentially just swell from here, because obviously that kind of populist base that he tries to get support from, anyone that's kind of on the fence will see, oh, well, look, assassination attempt. He's come out looking like a stronger leader, defiant, and then they can also frame that as, oh, look at these leftist Antifa mobs. Look how insane and unhinged these people are. We can't have someone that represents them, Joe Biden, the loony left, Kamala Harris, these types of woke figures. We can't have them leading the country. And that'll just push more votes towards Trump. Obviously, the election isn't for another couple months, so we're still going to have to wait and see. But I think this would be a really interesting point in the campaign, and it'll be interesting to see how it all changes and progresses from here, essentially.
And it comes at a very significant point because of the past week, there's been increasing calls coming out of America in the liberal media, such as the New York Times. There was an article written by the inevitable great American intellectual George Clooney, who was discussing
Continue, please.
discussing Biden's mental state, and he said that he was not the Biden of 2010 or the Biden of 2020.
No.
And that he basically wrote a long article just saying that the best thing for America and the best way to defeat Trump would be Biden to step aside. And then there was calls coming out of American Congress, a couple of senators, and even Nancy Pelosi, who said that he should have a hard think about his future. So there's been a lot of backlash and whispers and outright statements now coming from the Democrats for Biden to step aside because of his diminishing mental fortitude.
Yeah, and this does seem to be a fractious kind of topic within the Democratic establishment and the left in America.
Yes.
The political left.
The establishment Democrats, yeah.
Yeah, the establishment Democrats. And this actually segues quite nicely into our next topic because the failing mental state of Joe Biden has become more and more apparent in the last few days at the NATO summit, which was held in Washington. So, firstly, I think we need to wish NATO happy birthday.
Happy
75th birthday.
Correct.
I think a truly incredible achievement.
It has been.
Most terrorist organisations don't see 75 years. But so essentially what happened, this was just a gathering of all the NATO leaders in Washington, celebrating the 75th anniversary. And Joe Biden was seen, firstly, he introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as Ukrainian President Vladimir Putin, which was a hilarious gaffe. I don't think it was intentional.
I'll just add he received a huge round of applause after he said,
he did.
President Vladimir Putin, and everyone just started clapping. I was just sitting there watching it like, holy crap.
Yeah, they weren't really sure how to react to that one.
Yeah.
And I think Zelensky was probably taken aback a little bit.
Yeah.
But they did have some nice kind of wholesome banter where Zelensky was, I'm better than Putin. And Biden goes, you're way better than Putin. And so it was a nice little wholesome kind of friendly moment there that they enjoyed. And it just shows really how wholesome and amicable this whole relationship is, that they can have a joke around on stage and still, dig at each other and still go from there.
And I'll just add quickly, obviously a week earlier, he, in an interview to a radio station in America, referred to himself as the first black female president. And obviously he was referring to Kamala Harris and the fact that he would be the first president with a black female vice president.
Of course.
But what he said was that I'm the first black female president.
Yes.
And I was just sitting there and I was like, it's getting worse and worse by the week.
It is getting worse and worse.
And also something, obviously, negating his age, I also think when you are conscious of the fact that you're getting old, you're thinking more and more about not slipping up, especially when you're talking live and off script. So he would be thinking more and more about it, and that's just going to lead to making more and more mistakes.
Yeah, no, definitely. But that's what's even more impressive is that he also referred to his vice president, Kamala Harris, as Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is not only now the survivor of an assassination attempt, but he's also a black woman. Which
and the
vice president, which increases his popularity just tenfold. It's amazing.
It does.
Is there anything this man cannot do?
No, there's not.
No, there is
so,
not.
Getting back to the NATO summit,
yes.
Before we kind of delve into it and to, I guess, what was significant for Australia in the NATO summit, because we sent Richard Marles, our defence minister, Anthony Albanese stayed here in Australia.
Yeah, and despite the name NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, Australia is involved.
Correct.
NATO, yes.
I guess before we get into the details of that, I just thought I'd kind of ask you, because I think you've been doing a little bit of research this week, as to kind of what NATO is.
Yes.
Just a historical overview of what it is and kind of what it's done over the past 75 years, because we're hearing a lot, especially since the Russia-Ukraine war, a lot about NATO.
This has been a pivotal, has been an integral part of the whole subject and the whole conversation.
Yes.
So NATO was essentially founded in 1949, and it was like a defence/security alliance between the kind of Western European powers and the United States and Canada primarily. So I believe there were originally 12 NATO member states at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that included the US, Canada, UK, plus some of the other Western, like Portugal, some of the other Western European nations. It was essentially formed as a security bloc with the intention to provide a bulwark against the Warsaw Pact nations and against the influence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, of course.
So this is at the end of World War II?
Yeah, this is slightly after.
This is after
1949.
After Germany's been defeated.
Yes, and divided.
Correct.
Course.
And then you have the rising tensions of the Cold War. And so this was a pro-Western military alliance between America and some of its European counterparts to deter the Soviet Union.
Yeah, to deter the Soviet Union. And provide like a counterweight to, again, the Warsaw Pact nations and the nations that were under kind of the communist influence at the time, which was in Eastern Europe. So it essentially, for the majority of the Cold War, NATO functioned, essentially, it was just integrated training, weapon systems, exercises. So, for example, they would frequently be undertaking military exercises, etc., with the NATO nations. when it became more contentious, for example, was after the fall of the Soviet Union. Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, the majority of the countries that are in NATO now were not added until after the fall of the Soviet Union in the mid to late 90s and onwards up until the last 2 years in which Sweden and Finland have also been accepted into NATO.
Correct.
So, which begs the question of what was the actual purpose of NATO, because you'd think once the Soviet Union had been disbanded, then that would negate the necessity of NATO to exist, for example.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, this ties into the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, whereas one of Russia's perceived threats has always been the expansion of NATO eastwards onto Russia's borders. And we've seen that. We've seen, obviously, countries like Romania, some of the Baltic states, and now, now Finland and Sweden have all been accepted into NATO. So it's now been acting even more from the Russian perspective as an alliance that's there to surround Russia, essentially.
Yep.
And that's an understandable point of view. There was also, for example, at the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was an agreement reached that NATO would not expand 1 inch east beyond the borders of unified Germany, which it has subsequently.
This was a verbal promise by the president at the time, George Bush. Bush Senior to Gorbachev.
Correct.
They would not expand any
1 inch east, past
east.
the borders of a unified Germany.
Correct.
Now, it's been contentious again because this has become an issue after the Russia-Ukraine war. The conflict has kicked off. However, there's many people that said, it was kind of nothing was in writing. It was kind of a verbal handshake deal. But to my knowledge, the way international relations and diplomacy works is that diplomats discuss things and they make agreements verbally and over handshake deals, and not everything is necessarily written down pen to paper, whether it was or it wasn't. So the Russians have always seen this as kind of a threat and as a contradiction to the promises made for them. Interestingly enough, Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s actually, when trying to essentially reframe and reorganise a common European security architecture, actually requested to join NATO. This request was subsequently denied.
Hang on a second. Can we wind the NATO clock back?
Yes.
And can we go look at some of its greatest hits pre the Russia-Ukraine war?
Greatest hits, yes.
Because I think we can go back and look at NATO's involvement in other conflicts.
Absolutely. Well, there are a few bangers that NATO has participated in.
A few top 5 hits.
Throughout the actual Cold War, there wasn't as much direct involvement really in terms of interventions or military operations in other countries. Really kicked off after the kind of Balkanization of Yugoslavia, for example.
Which was the war on Serbia.
Yes, correct. The war on Serbia, amongst all the other kind of horrific, dirty little conflicts that emerged out of that political disaster that was the breakup of Yugoslavia. Pretty much NATO essentially bombed Serbia for 77 days, bombed Belgrade. They destroyed the Chinese embassy, which the Chinese, I think, took that as an insult and believed that was quite deliberate, even though NATO always said, that was an accident, etc. So it's a 77-day bombing of Belgrade and Serbia, which, again, resulted in the defeat of Serbia, shall we say.
The balkanization and destruction
of Yugoslavia.
One of the last kind of socialist functioning blocs, which was Yugoslavia.
And also an independent nation.
Which was independent of the Soviet Union.
And of the West.
Correct.
Which is important to note.
Yep.
After that, you have, for example, the NATO intervention in Afghanistan. You have NATO involvement and training in the war in Iraq. And one of the NATO's sleeper hits was the bombing of Libya. And
another banger that not many people know about.
Yes. And that actually resulted in the destruction of... No consequences from that. That resulted in the destruction of possibly the most successful African nation.
And one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters.
And still ongoing to this day, because we've seen what came out of the collapse of Libya. After that was the refugee crisis. We've got all the weapons that were supplied by the West to these rebel groups. They worked their way into Iraq, into Syria. You've got lots of these organisations that then, the remnants of which went on to become ISIS. And we're still dealing with that to this day. That was also kind of the start of the European migration crisis, which has kind of galvanised Europe since then, because obviously you've had millions and millions of refugees fleeing what were, more stable regions, and then heading to Europe, obviously, which has then kind of swung European domestic politics so far to the right because, again, illegal immigration became a massive political issue. And that's also fueled lots of simmering racist undertones in Europe, and they have now come to the forefront. And that's been an issue that the Europeans have been dealing with for the last decade and are still dealing with today, of course.
I'll just add a little interesting historical footnote that I was listening to Jeff Rich on the Burning Archives on YouTube. He does a kind of like historical analysis of different kind of like political events going on. Anyway, he was going back and he mentioned Libya, and he was talking about how the then Labour government under Kevin Rudd championed on the bombing of Libya and NATO's intervention, which I was a little bit upset to find out about because I've always regarded Kevin Rudd as someone that had a little bit more common sense than to champion these kind of blatant imperialistic wars.
Yes, of course.
But at the time, the Labour Party and Kevin Rudd were big supporters of that, which was...
And they're also big supporters of the war on Syria and the war on Iraq. So despite the kind of the softer domestic political rhetoric, I mean, we can see in terms of international relations and geopolitics, the same line has still been towed the entire time, whether it's Labor or Liberal in Australia. Unfortunately, that's a reality we have to deal with. Another interesting point of NATO involvement was after the 2014 Maidan coup/revolution in Ukraine, NATO trainers, officers, funding and weapons were integrated into the Ukrainian military. So even though Ukraine, that's a big contentious issue, is the Ukraine-NATO debate, even though they're not officially a member, they were a de facto member in every way but name, because they were getting trained with NATO weapons, NATO tactics, NATO strategies, and they were arguably the most effective NATO fighting force in the whole alliance after the United States and Turkey, of course. Even though they were never officially apart, they had 8 years of civil war experience in their military. And that just, I think, in my opinion, kind of shows what NATO really represents. Because if you, for example, lived in eastern Ukraine, then you would think, there's this military organisation which is supplying and funding and supporting the worst far-right, racist, ethno-nationalist elements in my country. If you lived in Afghanistan or Libya, for example, or Syria, or probably most everyday people in the Middle East, you'd probably see this organisation as a huge threat to your safety. Not as a defensive alliance, but as an out-and-out terrorist organisation.
You'd seen your country and neighbouring countries destroyed and destabilised by this organisation.
Absolutely,
So then you can kind of understand Russia's
apprehension, shall we say?
Yes, that's a perfect word. It's apprehension towards the expansion of NATO.
Absolutely, and of course, I think we can also understand their, apprehension to take anything that Western leaders say seriously. Given the history of how events have played out since the fall of the Soviet Union. So, whereas we don't have to necessarily agree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine or support it, we can understand, maybe have a bit more of a nuanced perspective on why did they feel this was a necessary outcome and a necessary step to take, essentially. What's interesting as well is lots of the NATO summit that's happened recently, lots of the rhetoric has been around, well, how do we make sure that, for example, if Joe Biden loses the election, how do we to Donald Trump, how do we make sure that NATO is still funded and still secure as an organisation? And one of Trump's kind of main policy platforms in terms of geopolitics has been, well, we're not going to fund NATO to the same extent as the United States has always been the primary funder of NATO, far surpassing what the rest of the other European nations put in terms of spending-wise. So a big focus of the most recent summit was, well, how do we make sure that NATO is Trump-proof, essentially?
Yeah, of course.
So that does tie in. That the whole, these are all connected. Do I think that if Donald Trump is elected, the situation with NATO will change? Not at all. I think he's doing that purely for domestic purposes. However, it's interesting to note that you can really see the fear in the NATO in the eyes of the NATO leaders when faced with the prospect of a Trump presidency. Because I guess that, even if I don't think it would happen, that seems to be a real threat to their position, essentially. Yeah.
Okay. So the summit itself was interesting as well for a couple of reasons. What is now referred to as the IP4, a great name for a boy band. Maybe the Backstreet Boys would have been better. So the IP4 is the Indo-Pacific Four, which is South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, which were all present at the NATO summit, which was just
But Jordie, NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Alliance.
It was NATO Plus, okay?
Plus.
You can just keep adding them on. You know, you've got like NATO Light, NATO Pro, NATO Plus. Yeah,
so
that's
it's like you've got Disney Plus,
correct,
Paramount. I understand.
You bring all the streaming services together, all the military alliances and blocks, into one great global military.
What do you think about it? It is a subscription service.
It is a subscription service.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, so just a couple of things. So Australia, so far since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, has donated over $1 billion in military aid, which kind of shows you the way that Australia is sort of welded to the hip of NATO and to America's proxy war in Ukraine. And we went there and promised more spending. We are going to give some missile defense systems, or I think we are either allocating money or the actual equipment itself that we've purchased. So we're going to be donating more money. I think it's going to be over $1.3 billion in aid in total, including military aid. Yeah, and it was interesting to see Australia there because what the IP4, the Indo-Pacific Four, represents is kind of the new expansion of NATO into the Indo-Pacific to confront China.
Posture up against China.
And NATO 10 years ago, in all of their statements and at their summits, never really mentioned China because it was never an issue. It was always to counter Russia. And just recently at this summit, it pivoted hugely towards China.
But Jordie, China's not in the North Atlantic.
Okay.
Why is this relevant? Why is this something we're focusing on?
I got some notes here. Give me 1 second.
Are you telling me that the organisation of NATO is a bit of a scam? Is this kind of where we're getting at? Is that it's just an alliance that's there to essentially project, kind of European, Anglo-American military force all over the world, and not just against the communist, the swarthy hordes of the communist Soviet Union,
the red hordes, and it's to fill the coffers of the military-industrial complex. Let's be honest. I know. I'm going to say it. No. Shock it all. I'm going to say it.
Are you telling me that this whole thing is a massive money-washing operation?
It's a huge money-washing. Oh and our great Australian comrade here, Julian Assange, has pointed this out about the 20-year debacle in Afghanistan that was prolonged just to keep making money for the weapons companies. And this effectively is what NATO really is, what it boils down to. It's just a huge...
I'm shattered. I'm shocked. I'm personally distraught by this information.
So, Jan Stoltenberg, who is the head of...
Secretary General
of NATO, he shows that, to quote him, he goes, quote, "This situation shows in today's world security is not a regional matter, but a global one, and that China now is one of... it goes, and declaring that NATO has entered a new era of enduring competition with China."
Wow.
This is straight from the horse's mouth.
Wow. Well, that's quite shocking.
It is, and this is where Australia is going to be dragged into it.
Well, this shows, I guess, a real what's going to be a real strategic challenge for Australia in the future, isn't it?
And I'll just add that the Quad, which was the predecessor to the IP4, which was America, Australia, Japan, and India, is now effectively dead because India is not a part of NATO. It has rejected any offers to join NATO.
Yeah.
And at the moment is in a close kind of economic and diplomatic relationship with Russia. It's buying lots of its oil and gas. And in my opinion, is trying to be an independent country and doing it very effectively. Is they don't want to join any of these military blocs. They don't want to posture up against China or Russia or be seen as the lapdog of the United States. They don't have great relationships with China, but they're in the BRICS with China. And they also have as I said, a very close relationship with Russia. And what was interesting as well is that the Indian foreign minister, whose name eludes me right now,
because Modi obviously didn't go directly to to the NATO summit, did he?
No. Well, Modi, no,
No,
because
he personally didn't attend.
no, because he's not part. But anyway, the Indian Prime Minister a couple of years ago was saying that we don't have the NATO mindset, meaning that we don't believe in these big confrontational military blocks.
That's interesting.
To stoke tensions with other countries, especially other superpowers that are nuclear armed. Well, so what I was just going to say, it really shows you the Indian mindset, which in my opinion is very independent. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see that they will not be part of NATO.
Well, I think as well that's what's important is the fact that India are very effectively playing both sides to their own benefit, for example. They're still milking the United States for, security, weapons, fighter jets, for example. Then they're also still maintaining a positive relationship with Russia because they're, for example, buying a lot of Russian oil and gas and then on-selling it to the Europeans and they're therefore making a healthy profit on the side.
Yep.
Costing the Europeans more and bypassing the Europeans.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So, like you said, it does seem that they are going in their own
direction.
direction.
This summit has coincided with a huge militarisation of Australia, an increase in our military budget. We're now spending 55 billion Australian dollars a year. So it's now at 2.2% of GDP. Yeah. And what I found really quite alarming...
That's about 2 nuclear submarines. For our audience, what
I found really alarming just reading the other day is that they want to get the military budget within 10 years, within the next decade, up to 100 billion. They want to double the military budget here in Australia.
That is terrifying.
Yeah, so it kind of coincides with the expansion of NATO and Australia's participation with it.
Yes.
The huge military expansion here in Australia that we're seeing, a huge increase into military spending while we have a crumbling health infrastructure at the moment.
Yeah. Our domestic infrastructure, is starting to fall behind, obviously.
Yeah. We don't
health
have
outcomes falling. Yeah.
No high-speed rail here in Australia. Yeah. No real kind of future plans for big infrastructure projects.
Massive cost of living crisis.
Going to get to the massive cost of living crisis and a housing crisis that we're going towards, but we've always got more money for military spending.
Yeah.
In the most recent budget, they announced another $50 billion on top of the 364 for AUKUS over the next 10 years. They put another $50 billion on top. It's just whenever there's money for military spending, they can find the extra dollars in their pocket.
Yeah,
but when you need to actually address systemic issues like housing, health, education, it kind of seems to be a sort of a trickle-down effect that we will create these kind of market-driven policies that over the next 10 years will deliver A, B, C, D, and E. But when it comes to dropping $1 billion to Ukraine or $50 billion into the military or $360 billion for nuclear submarines, the money is always there.
Money's always there. That's interesting.
And if we keep sliding in towards this confrontation with China and becoming much more closer with the NATO American global order, that's going to continue. So,
and then, of course, the further we slide into this alliance, the more that'll threaten our trading relationship with China.
Yep. And our security.
And our security, which that in turn is what has provided us with all our money, essentially, as a nation. It's our export surplus to China.
And that money from our surplus we then use to put back into the defence budget.
It's almost like it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
It doesn't make... I'm trying to think about it now. It really doesn't.
It's horrible policy.
No, goodness.
All right, well, I think that's enough about NATO for the moment. And you've been looking at another topic, which is a little bit more serious and disheartening.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's the fun part of today's episode, the part that we can have a laugh at. That's all come to an end. Essentially, what's happened is the esteemed British medical journal, The Lancet, have released a report in the last week or so, essentially detailing new estimates of the total civilian death toll in Gaza. So originally, from the start of the conflict up until now, the figures provided by the Gaza Health Ministry have been sitting at around 36,000 deaths. And what we saw was essentially within the first month to 2 months, we saw this huge death count that was recorded, and then that number has then since stagnated. So it's been pretty consistent and remained the same over the last few months. The Lancet have published a study essentially saying that a conservative estimate of the death toll is sitting at around 186,000.
Wow.
Vast majority of those being civilians. So the original death toll provided by the Gaza Ministry of Health, I think we have to understand the nature of the whole situation being that there's no public infrastructure in Gaza left anymore. So there's not very minimal functioning hospitals, the complete collapse of all sort of institutions. And I think that has also mirrored this stagnating death toll count, because there just simply aren't the people to do the counting. The hospitals aren't functioning. They're not receiving the dead bodies and the injured.
There's no system of recording.
Well, there's no system of recording, exactly. So what's happened is the Lancet Medical Journal, they have essentially undertaken a study. And in this study, they've said that, look, historically with conflicts, what happens is for every direct death caused by the conflict, there are going to be between 3 and 15 indirect deaths. So for every person that's shot or killed by a bomb or killed in fighting, etc., there's going to be between 3 and 15 people that die of displacement, starvation, lack of food, lack of sanitation, lack of aid access, etc., etc.
Yep.
Lack of widespread medical access to medical supplies, etc. So they've come to this figure of 186,000 people.
Yep.
Now, they came to this figure by essentially saying, like I said, for every direct death, there's between 3 and 15 indirect deaths. They've come to this figure by saying, look, for every direct death, we're going to just assume there's 4 indirect deaths, and that's how they've come to this figure, essentially. Yep. So they also wrote in their report that it's likely this is a very conservative estimate. Yep. It's likely the number's going to be higher. So the number could be 200,000, 250,000. The unfortunate reality is that no one really knows. And this is all compounded by the fact as well that there's just no real aid getting in, probably not sufficient aid.
Yep.
So we've seen the Israeli military essentially blockading aid from getting in. We've seen them intercepting aid ships, turning them around. We've also seen the IDF, Israeli Occupation Forces, Israeli Defense Forces, however you want to refer to them. They've essentially been sanctioning civilian militias at the border crossing with Egypt, for example, where essentially aid trucks are trying to enter, and you have just large gangs of civilians sanctioned by the military, just essentially halting them and turning them around.
Yep. I was just going to say is those initial numbers of 40,000 dead was confirmed by Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense for the United States government.
Correct.
So these aren't necessarily numbers by
the Hamas-run health ministry.
Yeah, well, they're not numbers from Palestinian sources. These are numbers that are recognised by the US government.
Correct.
And now you're saying that the Lancet, which is a esteemed medical journal, has done this investigation saying those numbers are just
far lower,
deflated.
Far lower.
It shouldn't be surprising because if you've seen any of the footage of what's going on, people on the brink of starvation, all the other disease that are caused by lack of sanitation. Food, access to food and water.
And as we've seen as well, for example, this initial death toll within the first, that was kind of recorded and has kind of plateaued after the first 2 months, the bombing, the intensity of the bombing and the fighting hasn't really ceased, but that number has essentially plateaued and has stayed at the same level. So I think you can make a pretty strong inference that, of course, the death toll is rising when the amount of bombs falling is still at a similar level. It's also funny to note that the Israeli government has been always saying, you can't trust the numbers given by the Hamas-run health ministry, for example. And now we're seeing that those numbers are accepted by the Americans as well.
That health ministry has always been taken as factual by the American and Australian governments.
And although we say the Hamas-run health ministry, I mean, any population still needs to have a functioning government,
and
functioning institutions, and they, despite all the pressure they have been under, being blockaded for the last X amount of years, they still have managed to have some sort of public schooling system, healthcare, garbage collection, etc. All the fundamental pillars that make up, a semi-functioning state and state institutions.
Yep.
So unfortunately, that's what we're looking at, and it's most likely that the number is quite a bit higher than that as well. Which leads us to what you were talking about, we were discussing earlier, Jordie, is the new appointment
So, yes, there's been
Australia.
a special envoy to anti-Semitism appointed by Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister. Her name is Gillian Siegel. She is a Jewish businesswoman and lawyer, and she has been appointed to advise the government on approaches to conflicting, quote-unquote, anti-Semitism.
And dealing with anti-Semitism, for example.
Yes, that's right. And it's interesting because just a few months ago in the US, they passed a law which was an anti-Semitic discrimination act, which has basically outlawed all critiques of Israel as a country or any of its actions currently in Gaza. So that happened in America, and then this just happened last week in Australia. Yeah, and what's interesting is that the Jewish Council of Australia, which has been very critical of Israel in the past and what's going on in Gaza at the moment, they have come out and described her as a Jewish lobbyist. I'll air quote that because that's what they've said.
Jewish organisation.
This is a Jewish organisation, which has come out and described her as a Jewish lobbyist. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of comes out of that. But it also shows you the way Australia is slipping, kind of following America's lead into outlawing any sort of critique.
And criticism.
Of Israel. And I think it's important to point out that any sort of criticism of a nation or a military or any of its public or political figures shouldn't be conflated with being racist towards that country.
No, absolutely.
That's exactly right. You can criticise Israel's actions at the moment without being quote-unquote anti-Semitic or being racist towards the people of that country. So that's very, very important to point out. And what will happen is that any sort of criticism towards Israel here in Australia, or even showing support for the flight of the Palestinian people or raising a Palestinian flag, can be conflated as quote-unquote anti-Semitic and may be outlawed in the future as they've done in America. And what I find really concerning is that right across the spectrum here in the West is that we uphold freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of the press, all those kinds of quote-unquote freedoms, which I support, as would most people that have a very different political point of view to myself would also support. We're slowly seeing those rights and those values eroded by legislation like that. So it's very concerning to see.
Well, that's supposedly what sets the Western liberal democracies apart from the more authoritarian axis of evil countries,
the axis
like Russia
of
and China and Iran and Venezuela and add X country to the said list, is the fact that we do supposedly have freedom of political discourse.
That's right, and we should. And it's, as I've said, it's the reason that you and I can sit here and discuss these things. And I never thought that right now I would have to be really cautious about the words I'm saying and uploading onto the internet just because of what's now happening with these kinds of laws.
And how we, of course, approach, critiquing
a
government that may or may not be essentially undertaking a large ethnic cleansing campaign, shall we say.
Correct, that's right. And I think it's important to point out is that public pressure is the way that policy and politics is changed and altered. A lot of people say that demonstrating, or even like, for example, the civil rights movements is a good case, is how public pressure does change policy. So to those people that say protesting will do nothing, it may, in the short term, not do a lot, but in the long term, it does change public opinion, does change the way that politics is run. And you've got to remember that the way that apartheid South Africa was defeated was because of global pressure, global sanctions. And here in Australia, the Conservatives at the time, under the Liberal Prime Minister, they were heavily critical of apartheid South Africa.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
and that is interesting actually as well, because funnily enough, one of the main reasons that the apartheid system in South Africa and that government did crumble was because they were sanctioned by the United States. So, for example, not allowed to sell them weapons anymore, for example, not allowed to sell them arms. And one way that they got around that, on paper, they weren't allowed to sell the weapons and arms. One of the ways they got around that was supplying them to Israel, and then Israel could then supply them to South Africa. Because South Africa existing in its current state still was geopolitically in line with the United States, with the kind of Anglo-American power elite, and obviously apartheid South Africa was a massive bulwark against anti-colonialism in Africa at the time. And that's also kind of, I guess we can transfer that and say, well, what kind of role does Israel play geopolitically in the Middle East? I guess they maybe, I'll leave that up to other people to decide, but what kind of role do they play? One that still upholds those values and that position of the United States.
Just while we're talking about South Africa, it's interesting to point out that Nelson Mandela was always referred to as a terrorist by the Americans.
He was, I believe. He was on the terrorism watch list.
He was, and he was imprisoned in South Africa before his eventual victory and the abolishment of apartheid South Africa. And he was a staunch advocate and supporter of the flight of the Palestinians and even visited Palestine as well. And
when he visited Palestine, he was quoted with saying, apartheid in South Africa is terrible. However, it's not as bad as apartheid that exists currently in Israel and Palestine. So there's some food for thought for the viewers and for ourselves. And hopefully that's the kind of thing we can all reflect on and learn from that as we try and build a better world for all people of all races, creeds, ethnicities, religions, etc.
All right, James. Well, I think that'll be a wrap. That's the show for this week.
Today. No worries. Awesome. Well, look, thank you everyone for tuning in and watching. Remember to like, comment and subscribe. Leave us some hateful comments. We actually do enjoy it very much.
Yes. Thanks for joining, everyone. Please, as James said, like and subscribe. Leave some comments of any type.
And we'll see you guys next time.
Catch you later.